Welcome everyone. In today's video, we're going to be asking the question, can we trust the Bible? And to make this video incredibly short, the answer is yes. But let's dive into this to explain why. The Bible. The nature of its origins is quite miraculous in nature, really. The Bible was written by 40 different authors over a span of 1,500 years on 3 different continents and in 3 different languages. And the overarching theme remains the same throughout the Bible, and that is God's plan to redeem mankind. The humanity shown in the main characters of the Bible is quite embarrassing. If you really wanted to sell this story, then you should really take out David, Rahab, Samson, Saul, etc., etc. The list goes on, pretty much every character. The Bible simply records what happened, even with all the messy details. And that's one reason we can know that they weren't making stuff up. The Bible is the most popular book ever written. It is estimated that there are around 100 million copies that are bought or given away every year. The Bible Society has estimated that around 2.5 billion Bibles have been printed between 1815 and 1975, a period of 160 years. I imagine there were a fair number printed before 1815 as well, and the Bible has been translated into 349 languages as of July 2023. It is directly translated from the original languages, which were Hebrew for the Old Testament and Greek for the New Testament. And there are some small sections translated directly from Aramaic as well. But that's it. That's all from the original language to English. Or in the case of the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Old Testament, we are translating from Hebrew into Greek and then from Greek into English. And it is also the most attacked and ridiculed book ever in history, as our next slide will demonstrate. 19th century writer H.L. Hastings wrote, "Infidels for 1800 years have been refuting and overthrowing this book, and yet it stands today as solid as a rock. Its circulation increases, and it is more loved and cherished and read today than ever before. Infidels, with all their assaults, make about as much impression on this book as a man with a tack hammer would on the pyramids of Egypt." So the hammers of infidels have been pecking away at this book for ages, but the hammers are worn out and the anvil still endures. If this book had not been the book of God, men would have destroyed it long ago. Emperors and popes, kings and priests, princes and rulers have all tried their hand at it. They die, and the book still lives. And he makes a good point. No book has been more attacked and scrutinized more than the Bible, and yet its popularity continues on to this day, continuing to outsell every other book in history. It is estimated that 5 billion copies of the Bible have been sold worldwide. In fact, when I looked up this stat in 2024, Bible sales had increased from 22% from the year before. So its influence continues almost 2,000 years after the canon of Scripture was formed. And we have 2 tests that we use to validate the Bible. We have the biographical test, which is the empirical and internal evidence, and we have the external evidence test, so evidence given outside of the Bible. The biographical test includes textual criticism. This is the study of analyzing the massive amount of manuscripts that we have and comparing them to each other to see how they differ, so that we can decipher exactly what the original text said. We can do this extremely well because we have very early complete manuscripts and even earlier fragments of the manuscripts to compare with. This is something that is relatively unheard of with other ancient writings. Most ancient manuscripts we have are hundreds of years removed from when the original was written, but this is not the case with the New Testament. Lastly, the books of the Bible include embarrassing details, which I kind of mentioned before, and undesigned coincidences that further prove the validity of the events described by the authors. So, textual criticism. So most skeptics will tell you that the transmitting of the Bible was done like a game of telephone, that one copy was recorded and then another copy of that was made with errors, and then that copy was copied with those errors, plus more, etc., etc., etc. But this chart in the slide here describes much more accurately how the Bible was copied and how we can always go back to all the previous copies to correct errors, or we can know where the errors were made. made. We can even know when the manuscripts were written based on the errors found in them, which is pretty amazing. The Bible was also spread over many regions all over the known world at the time, so we can even compare scriptures from different regions and see how they compare to each other. There was no one person or organization who had strict access to the scriptures and had absolute control over them. This was also good because it couldn't be changed, because it could be compared to so many other copies. Also, you'll hear claims that there are over 400,000 variants in the Bible. This is actually true. But the reason why is because we have so many copies of the Bible that, of course, you're going to have more errors the more copies you have. Just kind of common sense. This would be true of any manuscript that had many copies. But most of the errors that we find are spelling or grammatical errors. None of the errors affects any theological doctrine. So that's important. There are only 2 passages that are in question as to whether or not they belonged in the original, and those are the story of the woman caught in adultery in John 8, 2-11, and the ending of Mark in Mark chapter 16. Neither of these passages affect any doctrine of the Christian faith. Also, there are several verses that are included in the King James translation and not in modern Bible translations. This is because the King James version was translated from the Greek manuscript Textus Receptus. Since this translation was written in 1611, many much older manuscripts were found that did not have these verses in them. So they have been omitted from our more modern Bibles because generally, the older the manuscript, the more accurate it is. And over the course of 1500 years or so, some phrases got added to certain manuscripts, whether intentionally or not. But because we have so many manuscripts to compare with, we can know for certain which verses were originally in the text. And most modern Bibles will give a footnote explaining why the verse is missing, or they will include the verse but explain in the footnote that these verses were not originally in the oldest manuscripts, so nothing is hidden from us at all. We have the scribes to thank for preserving the scriptures that we have today. They took their job extremely seriously and would meticulously copy and recopy the Bible over and over. The Old Testament scribes would even count letters and spaces to ensure that each copy was exactly the same. We don't have nearly as many copies of the New Testament because of the persecution of the early church for the first 300 to 400 years of Christianity. Papyrus was also very expensive and it got worn out over time. There was no paper like we have today. We take that for granted, for sure. Opponents of Christianity would try to destroy Christian documents as well. It wasn't until Christianity was made legal that more copies began being made because they had more time and money to devote to the copying of the scriptures. And this is a nice slide just comparing all the different ancient manuscripts and the gap of time between them all and the total amount of manuscripts. So as you can see from this chart, we have way more copies of the New Testament than any other ancient writing. And the gap of time from when the original was written to that earliest manuscript is only 30 years. Compare that to the next closest time gap of 150 years between the original and the manuscript, with some as high as 750 to 850 years from the original. The number of Greek manuscripts of the New Testament we have is around 5,800 copies now, and this chart doesn't even include the over 18,500 copies in other languages such as Latin, Gothic, Coptic, etc. If you add all these together, we have around 24,000 manuscripts in total. Also, when these manuscripts were circulating, they were in such high circulation that they could be compared with manuscripts from other regions and countries. No one entity had sole access to the scriptures, which means no one group had total control over them and could change them without others being able to verify what the originals contained. And the first complete manuscript of the entire Bible comes in the form of a codex, which is like an early form of a book in the mid-4th century, around 350 AD. However, there are much more older, incomplete fragments of the New Testament that we have pieces of on papyrus, and many of them are from the Gospels. So this is an example of one of those fragments. So they all have a number with the designation P in front of them, which simply stands for papyrus. So P52 means it is a papyrus fragment, and it is the 52nd one found. This is an excerpt from John 18, verses 31 to 33, and it's dated to the first half of the 2nd century, so around 125 to 150 AD. And it is the oldest fragment of any of the Gospels that we have. And the book of John, of course, was written somewhere around 90 AD. And here we have another example called P90, which is a fragment of John 18, verses 36 to 19, verse 7. It is dated to the 2nd century, kind of early to mid 2nd century. And this was discovered in an ancient garbage dump in Egypt. So the New Testament books were written very close to the events that happened, all within the 1st century. Much too short of a time for legend and myth to evolve about Jesus. So the conservative scholars are going to date the Gospels much earlier than the more liberal scholars, of course. The biggest reason why the liberal scholars date the Gospels later than 70 AD is because Jesus mentions the destruction of the Jewish temple in the book of Mark, which happened in 70 AD. So they date it thereafter just because of this. Matthew and Luke seem to use Mark as a source, so they automatically date them later as well because of this. But Jesus actually predicts the future destruction of the temple. He never says it is destroyed. So they bring their assumptions with them in their dating because they don't believe in the supernatural. They don't believe in miracles or that God exists, most likely. So they assume in order for Jesus to know this, it must have been written later. But if God exists and he created the entire universe from nothing, and he is all-powerful and all-knowing, like the very definition of God implies, then it's not hard for him to predict the future, as God can see the future. And Jesus claimed to be God. So just because some scholars date the Gospels much later, there are many scholars that date them much earlier as well. So embarrassing details also give credit to the Old and New Testaments. So scholars agree that it is much more likely that an event took place if there are embarrassing details present in the account. They conclude that these things must have happened. Otherwise, why would they willingly add embarrassing details like these? They were simply recording what happened. If you wanted to make something look more credible, then normal humans would simply lie about the unfavorable details or not include them at all. But because the Old and New Testament authors include these embarrassing details, it gives extra credibility to these events having actually taken place. So we have a lot of examples here. You know, there's murder in the very first generation of humans. Noah is supposed to be this upright guy. He gets drunk and exposes himself. You know, Moses murders someone. David commits adultery. Israel is constantly following other gods. And in the New Testament, you know, the God we worship is crucified. His disciples seem clueless. One of his disciples, Peter, denies Jesus 3 times. Jesus calls Peter Satan. Judas betrays Jesus. Women were the first to find Jesus, and their testimony in that time wasn't seen as being reliable. That's just the way that culture was. And Paul calls himself the chief of sinners, not something you really want someone to call himself who wrote most of the New Testament. So the next evidence to support the reliability of the Bible is the existence of these undesigned coincidences in the text of Scripture. So this is when 2 or more passages from different books of the Bible complement each other with regards to added details that the other didn't offer, and this can't be attributed to the intentionality of the author. These books just happen to give extra details to help us understand the other passages better. So in these 2 Samuel passages, we learned that Ahithophel was the grandfather of Bathsheba, which is why Absalom, who is David's son, expects him to conspire against King David. But nowhere does it explicitly tell us in the passages that he is her grandfather. But as we dig into the story, we naturally come to this conclusion through other information that is given in the texts, seemingly unaware to the author of the text, even though the writer of the text probably knew this, but he never actually writes it that Ahithophel was the grandfather of Bathsheba, but we learn it anyway. And in Isaiah 39, 2 Kings, and 2 Chronicles, we learn about how representatives from Babylon come to Hezekiah, and he shows them all the treasures and storehouses of Judah. But this is odd because before this, Hezekiah has to give a tribute to King Sennacherib of the Assyrians, including the gold on the doorposts. So how is it possible that there's suddenly a full treasury in Judah following this? So 2 Chronicles 32:23 gives us the answer. And many were bringing gifts to the Lord at at Jerusalem and valuable presents to Hezekiah, king of Judah. So this seems like a contradiction until 2 Chronicles sheds light on the situation without the author's intention of doing so, which is pretty cool. And in John 13, we read about Jesus washing the disciples' feet, and it just kind of happens randomly, but we get more details in Luke 22 that recalls the same story, but tells us that the disciples had just been arguing about who would be the greatest in the kingdom. So Jesus was showing them an example of humility as a result of this. So Luke doesn't mention the feet washing, and John doesn't mention the argument, but together we get the whole picture. There's also another coincidence in both these passages. Jesus scolds the disciples for their arguing and tells them that even though he is their master, he comes as one who serves, even though he hasn't done any serving yet. In the John passage, we then read about how Jesus has just dressed himself as a servant and washed their feet like a servant. So again, the two passages complement each other and give us more details that the other did not give. In another example, in 1 Corinthians, we read about Paul saying that he sent Timothy to them to remind them about Paul's teaching. So Timothy was sent before the letter was received. So why does Paul give this instruction on how to welcome Timothy when he gets there? Wouldn't Timothy arrive before the letter as he was dispatched before the letter was? So in Acts 19, 21 and 22 gives us the answer that Timothy chose to travel by land instead of by boat up through the land of Macedonia. So we wouldn't have known this unless Paul had mentioned it in the book of Acts. So these are some of the examples of undesigned coincidences in the Old and New Testament. There are many more out there, but this is kind of what we'd expect to find if we heard multiple people sharing the same story, but from different times, different places, different perspectives, giving us, more details from each account. And this is exactly what we find when detectives interview multiple witnesses of the same crime. They'll all remember some of the same parts of the story, but they'll also remember different parts. When the detectives add all the accounts together, they get a much more complete story. And that is what is happening in the Old and New Testaments as well. So this brings us to the external evidence test. So this includes evidence from archaeology that verifies biblical accounts. We also have many ancient historians that corroborate what the Bible says, and the early church fathers are also another powerful piece of evidence to verify the New Testament. So we'll go through a few examples of some of the archaeological evidence that's been found over the years. So we have the Pool of Siloam, discovered in 2004, excavated in 2005 and 2006, and in John 9, Jesus tells a blind man to wash in this pool, to wash his eyes in the Pool of Siloam. And this pool is at the end of Hezekiah's tunnel and is mentioned in 2 Kings 20, verses 20, and 2 Chronicles 32, verse 30. So the next archaeological discovery we're going to talk about is the ossuary of Caiaphas. So ossuaries were boxes like this that people's remains or their bones would be placed in. And this was discovered in 1990. And Caiaphas is important because he was the high priest at Jesus' death and had a really big part in his crucifixion. So Matthew, Mark, John, and the book of Acts all acknowledge Caiaphas as the high priest when Jesus was crucified. And Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, also verifies Caiaphas's identity in his writings as well. And next, we have the crucifixion remains of a man's heel bone with a nail driven through it, which was discovered in 2017. And this is an important find because it confirms that the Romans crucified people, and they crucified them in the same way that the Bible describes Jesus was crucified. And the next archaeological evidence we're going to talk about is the Pilate inscription, which was discovered in June 1961, so quite a while ago, by an Italian archaeologist. And this confirms what the Bible said all along, that Pontius Pilate was the Roman governor of Judea during the time of Jesus' death. And we have the Tel Dan inscription. So this was discovered in 1993 at the site of Tel Dan in northern Israel. And this is really important because it's the first archaeological and historical evidence of the house of David. So many historians doubted the existence of David until this inscription was found. And we have the Hittite tablets, which were discovered in 1906 in Turkey by German professor Hugo Winkler. And 10,000 clay tablets were discovered during this time. And this gave us the first historical archaeological evidence of the Hittite nation. So historians doubted that the Hittites even existed until this tablet was found. So the Bible mentioned it thousands of years ago. They weren't really discovered until just over 100 years ago. So pretty incredible. And at the time of recording this, there were 53 people in the Hebrew Bible confirmed by archaeology. And we have a bunch of names listed there, just to name a few of them. And there are more being discovered each and every day. This number may very well be higher today, but pretty incredible. We keep finding more and more of these people that are archaeologically verified that are in the Bible. And the same can be said for the New Testament. So we have 30 people confirmed by archaeology and historical writings in the New Testament. And that's, again, at the time of this recording. It could very well be more today. And there are some of the names listed there. And there are obviously many more archaeological discoveries I could have mentioned here, such as Hezekiah's Tunnel, the Taylor Prism, the Moabite Stone, the Nazareth House, the Cyrus Cylinder, and countless other ones that we don't have time to mention and go through all of them, obviously. But suffice it to say, there are many archaeological discoveries that verify the Bible and don't always make it into the mainstream media. I wonder why that is. So we also have many ancient historians who wrote about Jesus, who were pagan, they were hostile to Christianity, and we're going to go through some of those here. So Thallus, he confirmed that Jesus lived, that he was crucified, and that there was darkness at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, which the Bible also adheres to. Tacitus reveals that Jesus lived in Judea, was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and had followers who were persecuted. Marabar Serapion, I'm going to pronounce these names wrong, sorry about that. His account reveals that Jesus was a wise and influential man who died for his beliefs, that the Jewish leadership had a role in his death, and that Jesus' followers adopted his beliefs and lived by them. Phlegon, his account testifies to the fact that Jesus was able to accurately predict future events or prophesy. He was crucified under Tiberius Caesar, and that Jesus revealed his wounds after he was resurrected. Pliny the Younger, his writings verify that the early Christians believed that Jesus was God, that they followed a moral code, and that they met together regularly to worship Jesus. Suetonius, from his account, we see that Jesus had a profound and immediate effect on his followers, causing them to be willing to endure persecution and torture to uphold their belief that Jesus was God. And Lucian of Samosata, from his writings, we learn that Jesus taught about repentance and the family of God, and that these teachings were adopted and spread throughout the world around them. Celsus, we gain some important information about Jesus' life, that he had an earthly father who was a carpenter, that Jesus claimed to be God, and that he had strange magical powers. So just from this list right here, we get a lot of information that is also verified in the Bible as well. So we have verification in the Bible, verification outside of the Bible about what Jesus was like and some of the events that happened in his life and some of the things that he did. So we also have many ancient historians who were Jewish who wrote about Jesus. These writers, these historians, were also hostile to Christianity. And the first one we're going to talk about is Josephus. So from his writings, we see that Jesus was considered to be a wise teacher, and that he lived in the region of Palestine, that he had the ability to do amazing things. He was condemned by the Jewish people. He was crucified under Pilate, and he had people who followed him called Christians. From the Jewish Talmud, we conclude that Jesus had magical abilities, that he caused the Jews to walk away from their beliefs, that he had followers who were martyred for their beliefs, one who was named Mathai, and that he was executed on the day before Passover. And the Toledat Yeshu, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong as well, but this is an ancient anti-Christian retelling of the life of Jesus. And from this writing, even though it tries to give a completely different interpretation of Jesus, we can still conclude from this writing that Jesus claimed to be the Jewish Messiah, that he was able to heal the lame, that Isaiah predicted his coming, and that he was worshipped as God, that he was arrested by the Jews, beaten with rods, given vinegar to drink, that he was given a crown of thorns to wear, that he rode a donkey into Jerusalem, that he was betrayed by a man named Judah Iscarioto, that he had disciples and followers who claimed that he was resurrected and left an empty tomb, and that he ascended after his resurrection. So from the Jewish accounts and historians, we still get a lot of information about Jesus that is accurate, that is also verified in the Bible. So again, we have biblical and non-biblical accounts of Jesus. So even if you took the biblical accounts away, we would still know a heck of a lot about Jesus just from the non-biblical writings about him. So the Bible gets the names right in which the time period it is supposed to be written. So names in the Bible are actually very important in helping place the Gospels within a specific time in history. So as we would expect, the most popular names are those with an added qualifier, like a description or a nickname. The Gospel writers will do this quite often when they're naming individuals. They'll use nicknames or qualifiers, such as Peter. He's often referred to as Simon called Peter, or Matthew, the tax collector, Simon the zealot, or Judas Iscariot, the one who would later betray him. And when we compare the most popular names, like the ones shown above in Judea and Galilee, with the names listed in the gospel writings, we find that all the names with qualifiers match with that time period, which is what we would expect to find if they were in fact written during that time. And in direct contrast to this, the Gospel of Judas, which is one of the Gnostic Gospels, which is written much later in the late 2nd or early 3rd century, gets the names incorrect. There are only 2 names that would fit if it is claiming to be writing about the actual time of the gospel events, and those 2 names are Jesus and Judas. And not only that, but there are a plethora of other names in the Gospel of Judas that are listed that were popular in Egypt in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, not Judea and Galilee during the 1st century. It would be incredibly difficult for someone writing in the 2nd or 3rd century to get the names and qualifiers right for the time and area they are claiming to be writing from. And yet, the Bible authors get this right, giving even more credibility to their authorship and demonstrating that these books were actually written during the time period they claim to be written in. And even if we didn't have any of the New Testament manuscripts, we would still have the majority of the New Testament from the scriptural quotes and references from the early church fathers. In the first 300 years alone of the Common Era, we have 935 quotations from the Gospel of Matthew, which is 87.3% of the entire book. We have 453 verse quotes from the Gospel of Mark, which is 66.9% of the book, 990 verses from the Gospel of Luke, which is 86% of the book there, and 859 verses from the Gospel of John, which is 97.8% of the text. So the early church fathers were quoting the Bible all the time, and because of that, we have a very large portion of all 4 gospel accounts. So the early church fathers also quoted from all the other New Testament books as well. So in total, there are over 1 million quotes from the Bible from the early church fathers from the late 1st century all the way to the Middle Ages. So even if we lost every New Testament manuscript, we could pretty much reconstruct the entire New Testament from all the quotes, references, citations, and descriptions from this enormous body of literature that we have from the church fathers. Here are some quick examples of 3 of the early church fathers who lived in the late 1st century to the middle 2nd century. So Ignatius quotes from 3 of the Gospels and 10 of the New Testament letters. Polycarp quotes from 3 of the Gospels and 12 of the New Testament letters. And Clement quotes from 3 of the Gospels and 4 of the New Testament letters. And here's another list of some more of the early church fathers who also quoted the Gospels and the New Testament writings. And there are many, many more than this. So there is so much evidence, you guys, that the New Testament is more reliable than any other ancient writing. If one is skeptical of the New Testament's reliability, then they would have to apply this same level of skepticism to every other single piece of ancient literature, because no other work is as attested as the New Testament. And now we're going to talk about the prophetic evidence and some of the prophecies that the Bible has made and how they've come true, how they've come to pass. And many of these prophecies were made years, sometimes hundreds of years before the events took place. And this was how the prophets were proved to be hearing directly from God, right? Their prophecies had to come true for you to be considered a prophet, and they needed to have a 100% success rate. There was even a Jewish law that if a prophet was proven to be false because their prophecies did not come to pass, that they would be stoned to death. So this was taken pretty seriously. And accurate prophecy is what we would expect to find if in fact God actually exists and does speak to his people. And this is one way that he confirms this for us. So with that, let's just go over a few of some of these amazing prophecies from the Bible. So 2 years prior to its destruction, Nahum predicted the destruction of Nineveh and how it would be destroyed. They will be entangled among thorns and drunk from their wine. They will be consumed like dry stubble. Nahum 1:10. Nahum prophesied that the Ninevites would be drunk at the time of their end, and this was confirmed by the ancient Greek historian Diodorus Siculus. I think I'm saying that right. And of course, we got to talk about Isaiah 52 to 53. And there is a reason why the Jews don't read Isaiah 52 to 53, because even they recognize that it resembles the life of Jesus too closely. And this really is an amazing prophecy, probably one of the most amazing in the entire Bible. And Isaiah was written 700 years before the time of Christ. And an entire scroll of Isaiah was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was dated to 150 to 100 years before the life of Christ. So this is really good evidence, guys, that God exists. For how else could anyone have predicted this accurately, the life of one person who would live 700 years in the future? And another one from Isaiah 44, verse 28 to chapter 45, verse 1. Cyrus is named and prophesied that he would conquer the Babylonian city 150 years before it happened. And he did this by diverting the Euphrates River into a large lake basin before marching his army across the riverbed and into the city. Isaiah also prophesied that Babylon would become a swamp in Isaiah 14, verse 23. And in the 1800s, when Babylon was excavated, they could not excavate the whole city because some of it was under the water table, just as Isaiah predicted would happen. The Phoenician city of Tyre was the empire's most powerful and prominent city. This prophecy from Ezekiel 26, verse 3 was written around 587 to 586 BC, and shortly after this, the Babylonians began a 13-year attack of the city in the year 573 BC. Then a few hundred years later, Alexander the Great put an end to the Phoenician Empire by attacking and conquering the city of Tyre in the year 332 BC. And lastly, in the year 1291, the city of Tyre fell yet again to the Crusaders and the Muslims, who destroyed it once more. And this is one of my favorite prophecies in the Old Testament about how Tyre's stones, timber, and rubble will be cast into the sea. So when Alexander the Great attacked the city of Tyre in 332 BC, it was located on an island just off the coast of the old city of Tyre that was destroyed by the Babylonians back in 573 to 560 BC. And they thought they were pretty safe there. That is until, like this prophecy predicted, Alexander the Great had all his soldiers throw the stones, timber, and rubble from the destroyed city of Tyre into the sea to create this land bridge to the island, and he ended up overthrowing the city, and this land bridge is still in existence today. So here is a rendition of the original island, the island city of Tyre, and the bridge that Alexander the Great constructed, and the present coastline as it sits today. And this is a Google Maps image of what the area looks like today. So you can still see the island there, and the land bridge is obviously a little bit wider now, but it still exists to this day. So we're going to talk about Bart Ehrman now. So Bart Ehrman is an atheist New Testament textual critic, and he wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus. And in his conclusions from this book, he seems to think that the reliability of the Bible is in question and that we can't really know for certain what the original documents said. And this is clearly the opposite opinion of the majority of conservative and liberal scholars who agree that we can and do know what the original New Testament documents contain based on the over 5,800 Greek manuscripts and thousands of quotes from the early church fathers that I mentioned in previous slides. But this is the opposite opinion he comes to in his academic work. When you read the appendix of Misquoting Jesus and his aforementioned academic work, you will see a different story altogether. So Bart was mentored by Bruce Metzger of Princeton University, who was one of the greatest manuscript scholars of the last century, and together they updated and revised Metzger's classic book entitled The Text of the New Testament. And here's what they conclude from this revised work. So Melinda Penner of Stand to Reason writes, Ehrman and Metzger state in that book that we can have a high degree of confidence that we can reconstruct the original text of the New Testament, the text that is in the Bibles we use, because of the abundance of textual evidence we have to compare. The variations are largely minor and don't obscure our ability to construct an accurate text. The fourth edition of this work was published in 2005, the same year Ehrman published Misquoting Jesus, which relies on the same body of information and offers no new or different evidence to state the opposite conclusion. So, as you can see, he only appears to be at odds with the conclusion he makes in his book, but in actuality, he admits that the New Testament we have now is the one that existed in the first century. And here is an excerpt from an interview located in the appendix of Bart Ehrman's book, Misquoting Jesus. So this is in the book, Misquoting Jesus, that he is trying to prove we can't know that the Bible is reliable. And here's a quote from an interview that he did from that very book. And he says, "Bruce Metzger is one of the great scholars of modern times, and I dedicated the book to him because he was both my inspiration for going into textual criticism and the person who trained me in the field. I have nothing but respect and admiration for him, and even though we may disagree on important religious questions, he is a firmly committed Christian and I am not. We are in complete agreement on a number of very important historical and textual questions. If he and I were put in a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like, there would be very few points of disagreement. Maybe one or two dozen places out of many thousands. The position I argue for in Misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament." So you see again, he only appears to be at odds with the conclusion he makes in his book, but in actuality, he admits that the New Testament we have now is the one that existed in the first century and that no essential Christian beliefs are even affected by textual variants. So why would he do this? Could it have anything to do with selling books? Could it be that writing a book that casts doubt on the New Testament would sell more than one that validated the New Testament? Could it be that he knows that he can easily pull the wool over the eyes of the general public, but cannot with his scholarly peers, which is why he contradicts himself between the two works? Bart Ehrman claims to doubt the New Testament, but in actuality he does not. But as an atheist, he is motivated and biased towards not believing what the Bible writes about to be true, such as the miracles described and the claims made by Jesus, so it makes no difference to him if he is honest about the reliability of the Bible or not. Remember that just because someone writes a book or something is posted on the internet doesn't make it true. Look into these things for yourselves. Don't just blindly trust the opinion of anyone because they all have biases and skew their views, including me. I have just as many biases that I have to be aware of as well. And now we're going to talk about some of the objections that you're going to hear about the Bible and its reliability. And the first one we're going to talk about is that the Bible is full of contradictions and discrepancies. And if you do a Google search listing Bible contradictions, you're going to get hundreds of results, as there do appear to be many contradictions. But to face these contradictions straight on, we first need to understand what the Bible is first. The Bible is a collection of books, letters, poems that were written over 1,500 years by 40 different authors on 3 different continents and contains many different genres, right? And each has a distinct style and purpose. So some of the poetic books of the Bible write about things that are not literally true, but point to some larger truth that the writer is trying to communicate. Like when Jesus says that we must hate our father and mother in order to follow him. He doesn't mean that we are to literally hate our parents to be his followers. He's saying that we need to follow him first before our parents, even if that means disobeying our parents. It's going to seem like we hate them, right? Because we are choosing to follow Christ first. Or when Jesus tells us to gouge out our eyes to keep us from lusting or sinning, right? He isn't saying that we should all make ourselves blind. He is simply using hyperbolic language to make a point about how serious the sin of lust is. So other books are historical in nature and should be read differently than the poetic books because of their genre differences in order to fully understand what is being written in them. Many of the books in the Bible are not books at all, but letters written to a specific people group for a specific time, and they were written to them first, not to us first. So we have to understand how the original audience would have understood what is written first to fully understand it through our modern lenses. Now, when we look at apparent contradictions, we first need to look at the context of the passages in question. Often these are not contradictions, but just different ways and styles that the authors communicate information. And when we read these passages, we see more often than not they are describing differences, not contradictions. Just because the account is different doesn't mean it is a contradiction. Usually one author includes extra information that the other author did not include, but they can both be true without it being a contradiction. And one such apparent contradiction is in Matthew 27, verse 5, that describes Judas hanging himself after betraying Jesus, while in Acts 1, verse 18, it describes him falling to the ground and bursting open. But in this case, both can be true. Right? He hung himself, and then when he was cut down, his body burst open after his body had swelled up after several days of hanging there. One author describes a different piece to his death, but both were true. They just described different aspects of it. Another example is, where was Mary standing during the crucifixion of Jesus? So Mark 15, verse 40 says that Mary was far off during the crucifixion, but John 19:25 says that she stood at the cross. This is a fairly simple supposed contradiction to rectify, as the Bible mentions that the crucifixion of Jesus took place over 3 hours. So Mary could have very easily been farther away while Jesus was being put on the cross by the Romans, and then sometime later, after he had been on the cross for some time, she drew near to him. So those are a few examples of what a lot of skeptics will come up with to try to discredit the Bible, and if we aren't aware of them or how to resolve them, they can cause us to question or doubt the reliability of the Bible ourselves, but that doesn't have to be the case. So another example of Bible objections is the Bible is full of killing and genocide, and it's all commanded by God. So first of all, I guess you would have to believe that the narratives that are written in the Bible are true in order to make this claim. So I guess that means the Bible has accurately recorded history? I mean, I think so. Skeptics will usually also complain that God must not exist because of the existence of evil. They're upset that God has allowed any evil to exist. And now, in this objection, God does something about the evil in the world by getting rid of the Canaanites, and now God is the bad guy. So God can't win. If he allows evil, he's bad. If he does something about evil, he's also bad. You just can't have it both ways. The Canaanites were not good people. They were evil. They would sacrifice their babies on a molten hot statue of Molech and watch them slowly burn to death. Okay, if that were happening today, everyone would be screaming at the government to put an end to this, to have them put to death for their crimes. So atheists tend to complain that there is so much evil in the world, and if God was so good, he would do something about it. And then when God does something about it, they complain that he is immoral for doing it. And God is the author of life. Therefore, he and he alone has the authority to destroy life, not us, because we are not God. We did not create all of life. And keep in mind that God used Israel as a judgment tool, just like he also used other nations to judge Israel when they rebelled. And to imply that there is something wrong with genocide, we have to assume an objective moral code, which is beyond us, transcendent of us, and that can only come from another mind, which has to be God. So Paul Copan is a guy who wrote a book called Is God a Moral Monster? And he talks about the use of hyperbolic language in the Old Testament. So there's evidence of the surrounding ancient cultures of that time that they used hyperbolic language to describe their victories over other armies. Just like when we talk about one sports team totally destroying another team in football last night, it doesn't mean that they actually physically murdered everyone. It's just a figure of speech to describe that one team scored much higher than the other team. This is also the case when it comes to the Canaanites. Hyperbolic language is used because it was normal to do so. And we see that the Canaanites are still there, just a few chapters after they were supposedly annihilated. And skeptics love throwing this one out there, that the Bible is at odds with science. And so first of all, we do need to understand when and to whom the Bible was originally written to, right? The Old Testament was written over 1,500 years, starting close to almost 4,000 years ago. So we need to keep this in mind when reading the descriptions given, as the ancient writers understood the world and universe very differently, and it was written in a way that they would understand. Secondly, the Bible was not written as a science textbook. Its purpose is to describe the redemption story between God and man, how man ultimately turned his back on God, went his own way, and how God chose to redeem those people back to himself, even though everyone deserved separation from God in the afterlife for our crimes against him. And let's not forget that the Bible was right when all the scientists in the early 20th century were saying the universe was eternal. It was the Bible that said our universe had a beginning. The Bible was more concerned with describing who created everything than explaining exactly every detailed step in how God did it. God only gave us a couple of chapters on the subject, and it was written, 3,500 to 4,000 years ago in a language that those people would have understood. Another thing that the Bible practiced or told the Jewish people to practice was isolation from sickness. And this was practiced when no one else understood how diseases were spread. And the Bible also talks about how blood is what gives us life in Leviticus 17:11. And now we give blood transfusions to people who require it. It wasn't that long ago that doctors would cut people when they were sick or attach leeches to them to try to bleed out or suck out the sickness in them. But now we can see that this would only cause more harm to the patient. Those are just a few examples of how, yes, the Bible is not a science textbook, but it does get a lot of scientific things right. It just describes them in different non-modern ways. And here's the last objection we're going to go through today, that the Bible was written by ancient primitive people and has no modern value whatsoever. So this is usually just a scoffing statement that skeptics like to make to give their arguments credibility. So anyone who reads the Bible can understand that these people were not primitive just because they lived long ago with no computers, cell phones, or motor vehicles. They understood a great deal of things and were able to write very eloquently about them. Just look at the book of Psalms, or consider how early they had a written language and were able to inscribe their writings into tablets and scrolls. That takes a great deal of ingenuity. And to say that the Bible has no modern value is laughable. Our entire Western civilization was built on the principles listed in the Bible. So you live like a Christian just for living in the West, because the values you appreciate are Christian in nature. Jesus taught the golden rule to love your neighbors as yourself, and even took it a step further by teaching his followers to love their enemies as well. Slavery was abolished because the Bible taught that all humans have intrinsic value given to them by their Creator. Hospitals and orphanages are in existence today because of the early Christians taking care of those who were rejected and left to die in the ancient Roman world. The morals in the Bible give stability to a country and allow it to prosper. So the Bible has just as much value today as it did 3,000 years ago in guiding us and teaching us who we are and what we are supposed to do and how we are supposed to live. So obviously a lot more could be said on each of these topics that I covered today. That's going to basically conclude our video for today. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you like this topic and you want more information about it and want to go more in depth about the things we discussed today, you can check out the writings of all of these guys here: F.F. Bruce, D.A. Carson, Craig Blomberg, Dan Wallace, N.T. Wright, Douglas J. Moo, John MacArthur, Wesley Huff, Bruce Metzger, just to name a few, if you want to deep dive more into this topic. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.